A woman in a band of 25 people wakes up one morning feeling wrong. Not hurt, not obviously sick, just wrong in a way she cannot yet put into words. She still gets up. She still eats. She still walks out with the others to gather what the day requires. 25 people is not a large number. It is small enough that everyone in it touches, feeds, and sleeps within arm's reach of everyone else, and small enough that losing even a handful of adults to illness in a single season could be the difference between the group surviving the next winter and not. 3 days later, if nobody around her had noticed anything, that wrongness could have moved through every person she shares food, tools, and sleeping space with. There is no clinic nearby, no isolation ward, no antibiotics, no working idea that something too small to see might be responsible for any of it. There is only the group itself, and whatever ability its members have to sense that something is off before it spreads to the people they depend on for everything. That ability turns out to be older and stranger than almost anyone assumes, and it is a large part of the reason your species survived long enough to eventually build the hospitals it now takes for granted. So how did people with no microscopes, no germ theory, and no working concept that a pathogen even existed manage to catch illness early enough to keep it from tearing through a small, tightly packed group of relatives and friends? The answer runs through the human nose, through the human face, through a primate cousin who reacts to contamination almost exactly the way you do, and through at least one skeleton in a cave in northern Iraq that complicates the whole story in a way nobody expected going in. The easy assumption is that ancient people could not do this at all, that prehistoric groups had no real framework for illness beyond bad luck, an angry spirit, or a broken taboo, and that sickness simply moved through a camp unchecked until it burned out or ran out of hosts to infect. Part of that assumption holds up. Nobody 60,000 years ago understood that a cough could carry a virus from one set of lungs to another, and nobody was identifying specific pathogens by name. But the evidence from psychology, from primate research, and from the skeletal record all points somewhere far more interesting than helpless ignorance. Ancient humans, and the animals they evolved from, ran something researchers now call a behavioral immune system, a set of automatic, mostly unconscious responses built specifically to detect and avoid sickness in other people, developed long before anyone had a name for what sickness actually was. The ignorance in that old assumption is correct. The helplessness is not. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Start with disgust, because disgust is not simply an unpleasant feeling that happens to you at random. Mark Schaller, a psychologist at the University of British Columbia who coined the term behavioral immune system, has spent years studying how automatically the human mind flags signs of possible infection in other people. Skin discoloration, unusual sores, a smell that registers as sour or spoiled, even subtle facial asymmetry. All of it gets processed by the brain as a potential threat within a fraction of a second, well before a person consciously decides anything is wrong. Studies using photographs of people with visible skin conditions or unusual pallor show that viewers rate those faces as less trustworthy and less appealing almost instantly, often without being able to explain why. That reaction is not shallow judgment. It is a fast, crude illness detector running quietly under conscious thought, built to make a call before there is time to reason one out. For someone living in a band of 25 people who all depend on each other daily, that reflex was not rudeness or squeamishness. It was the fastest illness detector available to a species with no other tools, firing before anyone had said a word or told a story about why a particular person looked off that morning. And the system is not fixed. It dials itself up and down depending on how vulnerable the body carrying it happens to be. In 2005, the anthropologist Daniel Fessler, working with Serena Eng and Carlos Navarrete at the University of California, Los Angeles, surveyed 496 pregnant women online and compared disgust sensitivity across different stages of pregnancy. The 155 women in their first trimester reported meaningfully higher disgust sensitivity than the women further along. That timing is not a coincidence. The first trimester is exactly when a woman's immune system is naturally suppressed to keep her body from rejecting the pregnancy, which makes both her and the developing fetus unusually vulnerable to infection. Her behavioral defenses appeared to ramp up precisely when her biological defenses were quietest, as if one system were compensating for the other without either needing a conscious plan. That is not the behavior of a simple aesthetic preference. That is the behavior of a detection system tuned by natural selection to match the actual level of risk a body is facing at any given moment. Disgust catches what is visible on the surface, but it cannot see a body that has already started fighting an infection quietly before any obvious symptom has shown up on the outside. So how do you catch an illness that has not announced itself yet, in a person who looks and acts completely normal? Part of the answer is smell, and the evidence for this is stranger than most people expect. In 2014, a team led by Mats Olsson at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden ran an experiment that sounds almost cruel in its simplicity. Volunteers were injected with a small dose of lipopolysaccharide, a molecule from the outer wall of certain bacteria that triggers a real immune response without causing an actual infection. It makes the body react as though it is under attack, without any bacteria actually being present. Researchers then collected sweat samples from these volunteers within hours of the injection, using t-shirts worn against bare skin, and had a separate group of people smell and rate them, alongside sweat collected from the same volunteers before they were given anything. The raters, who had no idea which samples came from which condition, consistently rated the post-injection sweat as more unpleasant and less healthy smelling than the baseline samples. Chemical analysis found no real difference in the overall quantity of odor compounds between the two conditions, which meant the shift was not simply that sick sweat smelled stronger. Something about its actual composition had changed, subtly enough that no one could say exactly which molecule was responsible, and obviously enough that human noses picked it up anyway. This happened within a matter of hours of the immune system activating, long before the volunteers themselves reported feeling noticeably ill. The human nose, without any understanding of bacteria or immune signaling, was picking up a chemical shift inside another person's body almost as soon as it started. That means a hunter-gatherer catching a faint change in the way a campmate smelled was not being fussy or paranoid. They were reading a real physiological signal that scientists only learned how to measure with a syringe and a laboratory full of equipment tens of thousands of years later. Smell catches what is happening on the inside, but there is a second channel just as fast, and it is carried openly on the face for anyone paying attention. In 2018, a research team led by John Axelsson, working with several of the same colleagues from the odor study, published a paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B that pushed this even further. They photographed volunteers roughly 2 hours after giving them the same kind of immune-triggering injection used in the smell study, alongside photographs taken after a placebo. Then they recruited independent raters, around 60 in total, and had them look at the paired photographs for a few seconds each and guess which image showed a sick person, using nothing but the face in front of them. The raters picked out the sick photograph at a rate clearly above chance, based on cues most of them could not consciously name. Paler skin and lips, slightly more swollen features around the face, corners of the mouth drooping just a little, eyelids sitting heavier than usual, a duller, less glossy quality to the skin, and an overall look the raters simply described as tired. And this was only 2 hours after exposure. The volunteers themselves were often still going about ordinary conversation, not yet reporting that they felt particularly unwell. Their faces were already broadcasting a change that a stranger could pick up on from a photograph, before the person wearing that face had fully registered anything was different. A later follow-up pushed the question even further, testing whether this ability depended on growing up around Western faces and Western media, the way recognizing a specific celebrity or brand logo would. Researchers showed the same kind of sickness photographs to people in communities with little or no exposure to the original population the images came from, People who had never seen these particular faces, this particular skin tone, or this particular set of cultural cues before in their lives. The detection ability held up regardless. Strangers who shared no language, no history, and no visual vocabulary with the photographed volunteers could still tell, at a rate better than chance, which face belonged to a body actively fighting an infection. That result matters, because it rules out the possibility that sickness detection is a learned cultural skill, something absorbed the way you'd learn to read a particular fashion trend or a regional style of dress. It behaves instead like something closer to language or facial expression itself, a built-in human capacity that shows up wherever you look for it, running quietly underneath whatever culture happens to be sitting on top of it. If total strangers in a laboratory can read illness off a photograph they have 5 seconds to study, consider what happens inside a small group of people who have known each other their entire lives, who share a fire every night, and who look directly at each other's faces dozens of times a day. That kind of familiarity does not dull this kind of detection. It sharpens it considerably, which raises an uncomfortable question about how old this whole system actually is, and whether it belongs to humans at all. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It does not belong to humans alone, and the evidence for that comes from a very different set of primates. Andrew McIntosh, a primatologist at Kyoto University's Primate Research Institute, has spent years studying wild Japanese macaques, including troops living on Yakushima Island. Working with his colleague Cécile Sarabian, McIntosh ran a series of field experiments in which the researchers deliberately placed food, and in some cases actual feces, in the monkey's path to see how the animals responded to potential sources of contamination. The macaques consistently avoided handling or eating food that had come into contact with feces, reducing their contact time and altering how they approached it, in a pattern that closely resembles the disgust response you would show if you were handed the same object. This was not something the macaques had been taught. It showed up reliably across individuals with no shared cultural transmission required, which strongly suggests it is built into the basic operating system of the primate brain, humans included. McIntosh's broader body of work on the same macaque populations adds another layer to this. By tracking hundreds of days of grooming behavior across a wild troop and mapping who groomed whom, his team found that the most socially central females, the ones receiving the most grooming from the most different partners, carried noticeably lower loads of lice than their less connected troop mates. Grooming physically removes external parasites, so animals embedded in a dense web of relationships were, in effect, getting scrubbed down more often. Social connection was not just an emotional resource. It was functioning as a literal hygiene system, run entirely through touch, with no monkey anywhere aware that this was what it was doing. That avoidance instinct, and the grooming network sitting alongside it, did not arrive with human culture or human language. Both are inherited from a much older primate lineage, running in animals that have never told a story, never named a disease, and never needed to. Which means the entire toolkit described so far, the disgust reflex, the recalibration under vulnerability, the reading of smell and face, sits on top of an even older foundation shared with distant cousins who split from the human line millions of years before anyone carved the first tool. But avoidance is only half of what the archaeological record actually shows. Alongside every sign of animals and early humans pulling away from potential contamination, there is also clear evidence of the opposite instinct, people who moved toward suffering group members instead of away from them, at real and lasting cost to themselves. That evidence comes from a cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq called Shanidar, excavated beginning in 1957 by the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki. Among several Neanderthal skeletons found there, one individual, known ever since as Shanidar I, lived a genuinely difficult life. His skull had absorbed a massive blow to the left side of the face, crushing the eye orbit and very likely leaving him blind on that side. His right arm had been fractured repeatedly and was ultimately lost, probably amputated, leaving a smooth, fully healed stump ending above the elbow. Bony growths inside his ear canals, identified decades later by the researchers Eric Trinkhaus and Sebastian Villot, would have left him profoundly deaf. His foot bones showed old fractures, and his skeleton carried signs of a systematic degenerative condition layered on top of everything else. He lived, based on how completely these injuries had healed by the time he died, to somewhere around 40 or 50 years old, which counted as remarkably old age in his world. By any practical measure, this was a person who could not have hunted effectively, could not have defended himself in a serious confrontation, and would have struggled badly with basic daily tasks, like preparing hides or processing food. Even holding a tool steady would have been difficult, with one arm gone and vision reduced to a single working eye. And yet the healing in his bones proves he survived for years after his injuries stabilized, not weeks. That kind of survival does not happen by accident. It requires other people noticing that someone is struggling, and then choosing, repeatedly, over a long stretch of years, to share food and shelter with a person who could give very little back in return. Detecting who was suffering did not automatically mean pushing that person out of the group. Sometimes it meant the opposite, an entire band organizing part of its daily effort around someone who could no longer contribute in any of the usual ways, because the group had apparently decided he was still worth keeping. There is a real difference, though, between caring for a companion whose condition will not spread to anyone else and confronting an illness that could take the whole group down with it. Shanidar I's injuries were not contagious. Nobody caught his blindness or his missing arm by sharing his fire. That is where this story turns considerably harder, and the evidence for it sits in a village that spent the last 9,000 years quietly submerged under the Mediterranean. Off the coast of modern Israel, near the town of Atlit, there is a Neolithic village called Atlit Yam that now sits several meters underwater, sunk beneath rising sea levels after it was abandoned. Radiocarbon dating places the site at roughly 9,000 years old, somewhere between 9,250 and 8,160 years before present. When archaeologists began excavating the site, they found something that reset a significant part of the medical history timeline. Israel Hershkovitz, an anatomist at Tel Aviv University, noticed distinctive lesions on a set of skeletal remains that matched the bone damage caused by tuberculosis. A research team led by Helen Donahue and Mark Spiegelman at University College London then analyzed the bones directly and confirmed both DNA and cell wall lipid biomarkers from Mycobacterium tuberculosis in the remains of a young woman, roughly 25 years old, buried together with an infant of about 1 year, almost certainly her child. It stands, to this day, as the earliest confirmed case of human tuberculosis anywhere in the archaeological record, roughly 3,000 years earlier than the next oldest confirmed case. The timing of that discovery matters as much as the discovery itself. Atlit Yam was not a small, mobile band of 25 people moving across open country. It was a settled Neolithic village, home to a much larger population living in permanent stone structures, keeping some of the earliest domesticated cattle in the region, and sharing a fixed water supply year-round. Excavators also found evidence at the same site of other health burdens the villagers were managing, including signs consistent with malaria and a distinctive ear pathology linked to repeated cold water diving, which tells you this was a population already carrying more chronic disease exposure than a mobile band would typically face. That shift, from mobile bands to dense, fixed settlements, was extremely recent in evolutionary terms, and it changed the entire landscape a pathogen had to work with. Tuberculosis thrives on exactly these conditions: close, prolonged contact between the same people, day after day, month after month, breathing shared air inside enclosed structures that a mobile band would rarely have occupied for more than a few nights running. Tuberculosis is also a uniquely difficult disease for every detection system described so far. It does not spike a fever within hours the way an acute bacterial infection does. It moves in slowly, sometimes over months or years, with a long stretch during which a person is already contagious but shows almost none of the obvious cues that disgust, smell, or facial changes are built to catch. There is no dramatic 2-hour photograph moment with tuberculosis. There is a persistent cough that seems ordinary at first, gradual weight loss that is easy to explain away, and a slow decline that never triggers the same fast, automatic alarm an acute illness does. This is precisely the scenario the ancient detection toolkit was worst equipped to handle: a chronic, quietly contagious disease, arriving at almost exactly the moment human settlements became large and dense enough for it to spread efficiently for the first time in the species' history. So if smell and faces and instinct could not fully catch something moving this slowly, what did people actually do once someone in a crowded village clearly was not getting better, week after week, with no sign of turning a corner? That question does not have one clean answer, but the archaeological record does offer a partial one, and it starts with what people put in their own mouths once they realized something in the body needed help. The clearest evidence comes from El Cedrón cave in Asturias, in northern Spain, home to the remains of a group of Neanderthals who died there between roughly 50,600 and 47,300 years ago. In 2012, the archaeologist Karen Hardy, then affiliated with the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies and the University of York, led a team analyzing hardened dental plaque, called calculus, preserved on the teeth of 5 individuals from the site. Using a technique called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry, the team identified microscopic chemical traces embedded in that ancient plaque, letting them reconstruct exactly what these Neanderthals had been putting in their mouths. One individual in the study, designated Adult 4, carried compounds called azulines and coumarins in his calculus, chemical signatures produced specifically by yarrow and chamomile. Both plants are strikingly bitter and offer essentially no caloric or nutritional value, but both have a long documented history in later human cultures as remedies, used for pain relief and inflammation. Earlier genetic work on the same population had already confirmed that the El Cedrón Neanderthals carried the gene responsible for detecting bitter compounds, meaning Adult 4 would have tasted exactly how unpleasant these plants were and eaten them anyway. Hardy and her colleagues did not claim this Neanderthal understood pharmacology in any structured, theoretical sense, but deliberately chewing something that bitter, with zero food value, while fully capable of tasting how bad it was, does not look like an accident of foraging. It looks like a targeted response, made by someone who was not well and reached for something specific because some accumulated knowledge, passed down or learned by trial, told him it might help. There is a related and more contested piece of evidence worth mentioning honestly rather than presenting as settled fact, because Deep Human doesn't sand down the messy parts. At the same Shanidar site where Shanidar 1 was found, Ralph Selecki excavated a separate burial he labeled Shanidar 4, where soil samples reportedly contained unusually high concentrations of pollen from flowering plants with documented medicinal uses, including yarrow and cornflower. Selecki argued this suggested a deliberate ritual involving medicinal flowers laid across the body. A later researcher, Jeffrey Summer, raised a serious alternative explanation. The pollen could have come from a species of burrowing rodent known to cache seeds and flower heads underground near its burrows, which could easily have mixed into the grave soil long after the burial took place, with no human involvement at all. Both explanations remain genuinely live in the research community, and this particular case stays unresolved. What is not in dispute is the calculus evidence from El Cedrón. Once someone in a group was noticeably unwell, the response was not limited to avoidance on one end of the spectrum or unconditional long-term care on the other. Sometimes it meant reaching for something specific, something bitter, something that did not taste anything like food, because on some level, someone believed it helped. Put all of these pieces together, and a fuller picture starts to form. A behavioral immune system that fires disgust responses in a fraction of a second and adjusts its own sensitivity depending on how vulnerable the body carrying it happens to be at that moment. A sense of smell capable of registering an immune response inside another person's body within hours of it starting. Facial cues subtle enough to require a laboratory camera and a research team to formally prove, yet readable by strangers across cultures with no shared background at all. An avoidance instinct inherited from primate ancestors who never spoke a single word to each other. And running alongside all of it, real evidence of intensive, years-long care extended to the sick and injured, plus specific plants sought out deliberately for their bitter, non-food properties, whenever something in the body clearly needed correcting. None of this required germ theory. None of it required a word for bacteria or virus, or any formal understanding of contagion at all. It ran on pattern recognition built up over hundreds of thousands of years of small groups, depending entirely on each other's survival, refined the same slow way eyesight or hearing was refined, through the plain fact that individuals who caught these signals early, or who cared for a sick companion without endangering everyone else, tended to leave more descendants than those who did not. The same reflexes are still running in you right now, mostly without your permission. The flinch away from a stranger coughing hard on a crowded train, the sudden wariness around someone who looks unusually pale or sweaty, the specific wave of disgust triggered by the smell of vomit long before you've consciously registered any actual health risk to yourself. The odd, hard-to-explain instinct to keep a little more distance from a coworker who mentions they haven't been sleeping well and look run down, even though nothing about that description involves contagion at all. None of that is squeamishness, and none of it is something you were taught in school. It is a detection system built during the Pleistocene, tested for hundreds of thousands of years in small bands with everything on the line, still doing its job today in a body that has never once stopped running it, in a world so different from the one it was built for that most of us never stopped to notice it firing. Consider the single strangest fact buried in all of this. In a laboratory in Stockholm, using nothing but a photograph, independent strangers correctly identified who among a group of volunteers had an activated immune response, based on a picture taken just 2 hours after exposure, before the person in the photograph had even reported feeling sick. A stranger, a photograph, 2 hours. That is how fast, and how quietly, the human capacity to detect illness in another person actually operates, running on cues most people cannot name and would never consciously notice they were using. Ancient humans built no laboratories and wrote down no theory of infection, and they still ran an early warning system precise enough to keep small bands of 20, 30, 50 people alive across hundreds of thousands of years, using nothing more than noses, eyes, instinct, and long familiarity with each other's faces. Some of that system pulled people apart, when distance meant survival for everyone else. Some of it pulled people together, holding on to an injured man in a cave in Iraq for years after he stopped being able to hunt, or pressing bitter yarrow into an aching mouth because something told a Neanderthal it would help. And some of it simply failed, quietly, in a stone village by the sea, against a disease too slow and too patient for any of the old alarms to catch in time. All three outcomes came from the exact same set of tools. Long before anyone could explain why any of it worked, or admit that sometimes it wouldn't, it was already running, quietly, in the background, the same way it still is in you. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.